Something you have to understand is that dogs do what works for them. If there's something in it for them, they're going to repeat the behavior. Now, if you bring a new dog in or a new puppy in, or maybe you've been letting your dog slide with a little bit too much freedom for months or years now, they're going to gravitate towards all the things that worked for them naturally. And it doesn't matter if you were there to observe it or not, but that principle is always present. Not only that, but the principles of operant and classical conditioning are always present, whether you are aware of it or not. If you give the dog too much freedom and you haven't taught them what to do, or you don't have a solid way to control their behavior, they're likely just going to find things that work for them, but not necessarily for you. And in most cases, it goes against what you want them to do. Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to chapter 2. And in this chapter, what we're going to go over is how to set up a solid foundation that we can build all of our other future training off of. Now, this is a topic and a group of concepts that I know from firsthand experience that a lot of pet dog owners are just simply unaware of. I've been working with pet dog owners and their dogs for 7-8 years now, and I do a lot of in-homes these days. And if it's something I see time and time again, it's that the foundation isn't really there, or if it's there, it's very, very weak. And we all know that saying, a house that is built on sand isn't going to last, right? It's going to crumble as soon as any sort of issues arise, right? And that goes for anything, and dog training is one of those things. So it's important that you have a super solid foundation. Let's go ahead and get started. In chapter 1 of this series, we went over the importance of envisioning the right dog and then properly selecting and evaluating the dog that you want and need for you and your family, your wants and needs, depending on what you want to do with them. We also went over the pros and cons of getting a puppy versus getting an adult dog, and so on. We went through all of that. I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you probably got a new puppy, or you got a new dog, or the vast majority of you are likely people who are working with a dog that you've had for many years, or have had for an extended period of time, right? And you're looking to tighten up their training, trying to get their training more functional, and you're looking for something to help you. Well, depending on which group you're in there, this beginning phase can look a little bit different. The good news is that the main principle, the overarching principle between all three of those groups is the same. But the angle from which you come at it can look a little bit different depending on where you're starting. For example, there's going to be certain things that a new puppy owner is going to have to do that a new dog owner won't have to do. And for somebody who's working with a dog that they've had for many years, there's going to be certain aspects that they're not going to have to worry about that the new puppy people are going to have to worry about. So as we go along, I'm going to do my best to address those slight variations and talk about them very briefly as they arise. If you have a specific question for your situation or whatever, feel free to ask it in the comments. Otherwise, I'm going to do my best to be as inclusive and helpful as possible for as many different people as possible. So in the beginning here, there could be quite a bit of information going down the funnel, I suppose, but as we go along, we'll all kind of end up in the same place. And from there on out, it's the training and everything is basically all the same. So this first thing you want to do really only pertains to people that got a new dog or a new puppy. If you're working with a dog you've had for a while, this doesn't really apply to you at all. So you can kind of skip through this if you want. What you want to do is give the dog or puppy time to take in the new environment and get used to everyone and everything in it. If you put yourself in the dog's shoes, put yourself in the puppy's shoes, it should be pretty easy to see that the environment they're in now with you is likely very, very different than where they were. And there's likely going to be new stimuli that they have never seen before that can make them a little bit uneasy. And every dog is going to be a little bit different when it comes to this. So you just want to give them time to settle in before you start doing any real sort of training with the dog, right? Because just like us, dogs don't learn very well if they're nervous or anxious, right? If the environment feels even somewhat threatening or uneasy to us and somebody's trying to teach you something, it's going to be hard to pay attention because you're kind of got one eye, one ear on what you're trying to pay attention to, and one eye, one ear on things that are freaking you out, right? So you want the environment to be comfortable to the dog before you start working on things with them. Even though these first things we're going to work on with the dog are going to be very easygoing. For some dogs, the ones that are a little bit more anxious, a little bit more environmentally unstable, maybe not so sociable, that it can be enough to throw them off and potentially create some sort of negative association that you didn't intend to create. And that's just simply because of how the dog views the situation and the environment, right? So to minimize that, give the dog at least a few days to settle in. Really, the time frame is going to be very dependent on the dog. Like I said, if you got a dog that's more anxious, more environmentally unstable, not so sociable, then it could take a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks before they look like they're comfortable and used to the new environment and you, right? Or a more environmentally stable dog, a more social dog, confident dog, it may only take a few days. Hell, maybe even the same day, the dog can look like that they've been there for years already, right? And I suppose my main thing I'm trying to convey to you guys is if you feel like the dog is uneasy in any way, they're not completely comfortable yet, don't worry about training right now. Don't worry about doing anything with them. You're just going to allow them to get used to you and the new environment. So while the new dog or puppy is getting used to the environment, we're also going to set up a routine for them or set up a procedure with them that's going to help them get used to the new environment. This also applies, by the way, for my people that are working with a dog you've had for a while. This is where you can start as well. Just hitting the reset button with your dog. You can pretend like they're a new dog, except you don't have to act like they're not used to the environment because they're used to the environment. But right here is where you can start, or a good place to start over. And that is in developing a new routine or developing a routine that's going to make it a lot easier to build really solid training off of going forward. And essentially what we want this new routine to do is, one, be conducive to future training. Two, we want it to create good habits and create good behaviors, while at the same time it prevents unwanted or bad habits and behaviors from forming in the first place. Two tools you're going to need for this, your two best friends for a little while, are going to be a crate and a leash. And what you're going to do with the crate and the leash is you're basically going to be supervising the dog at all times, or you're going to know exactly where they are and what they're doing at all times. And that's where the crate and the leash comes in, because essentially what you're going to do is either have the dog in a crate when you cannot directly supervise them because you got to make dinner or do something with your kids, take a shower, go somewhere that they can't come along with, whatever, they go in the crate. Whenever you cannot directly supervise the dog, they go in the crate. But when you can directly supervise the dog or interact with them in some way, whether it's through play or training or hanging out or whatever, in those cases, then have the dog on a leash or have a little tagline on them. Tagline is a leash, but it's just very, very short. It can be like 6 inches to a foot or so. Or you can just put a standard 6-foot leash on them as well. That's all fine and dandy. But basically, they're going to be dragging that leash, yes, even in the house. I recommend that for the vast majority of people, but really that's kind of dependent on the dog. But so you don't necessarily have to use the leash for this. What's most important is that you are directly supervising the dog. So you can intervene if they start doing a behavior you don't want them to continue doing, or doing a behavior that you don't want them to continue practicing. It's just that whenever they have a leash on in the house or that tagline or whatever, it's a lot easier to manage them physically on a leash than having to grab their collar or anything like that. So I generally recommend for most people to have a leash on their dog even in the house. So to summarize all that, dog is either in the crate when you can't directly supervise them, or if you can directly supervise them or interact with them, they can be outside of the crate, but you are right there and you have some way to control them if they get squirrely on you. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know that a lot of times whenever I tell people this, I can see the look on their face, or I can see their body language kind of change, and they're like, oh, geez, that seems a little harsh. So the dog isn't going to have any freedom whatsoever. And the frank answer is no, they're not. And the reason for that is something I actually made an entire video over because I felt it was that important. I'll link that video up there so you guys can watch it if you want to, but I'm going to try to encapsulate it now. Something you have to understand is that dogs do what works for them. If there's something in it for them, they're going to repeat the behavior. That's reinforcement, positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. If there's something in it for them, they're going to repeat it. It's that simple. Now, if you bring a new dog in or a new puppy in, or maybe you've been letting your dog slide with a little bit too much freedom for months or years now, they're going to gravitate towards all the things that work for them naturally. And it doesn't matter if you were there to observe it or not. But that principle is always present. Not only that, but the principles of operant and classical conditioning are always present, whether you are there or not, whether you are aware of it or not. And if you give the dog too much freedom and you haven't taught them what to do, or you don't have a solid way to control their behavior, they're likely just going to find things that work for them, but not necessarily for you. And in most cases, it goes against what you want them to do. And some very common examples of this, and I used a couple of these in that video actually, but one is dumpster diving, right? The dog sniffs out a half-eaten sandwich in the dumpster, goes over to the dumpster, gets in it, pulls out a sandwich, gets reinforced for it, right? That's positive reinforcement. Now, what do you think the dog's going to think about that trash can whenever they go by it? Or all trash cans at some point. If they do it to too many trash cans, they'll generalize it to all trash cans. But what do you think they're going to do? They're going to start dumpster diving, right? Now you're going to have a hard time keeping the dog out of the trash. Another one is counter surfing. It's basically the same idea as the dumpster diving, except the food is now on a counter instead of a dumpster, right? So now you have a counter surfer. Dog knocks over a plate of food off the counter one time, and they're like, hey, this is great. Or they jump up there and they snag a sandwich off the countertop. Hey, that's great. They're going to do that more now. Some other examples are roughhousing with the kids, because kids are basically little squeaky toys to a lot of dogs. They like to make them move, make them squeal, and that's all just fun for the dog. That's all just positive reinforcement for the dog. So if you're not supervising that, you're not managing that, and you want your dog to not harass your kids all the time, well, you can't just let them have free reign to do whatever they want with the kids. Same thing goes with cats and other livestock you may have. Other examples of this, I think I used in that video, was in the form of negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement is whenever you relieve or remove some sort of aversive experience off of the dog to create a behavior. And how this can happen naturally in a home life is, let's say your dog's a little bit on the anxious side and the UPS man comes by to drop off a package. Well, your dog is anxious and the UPS man is a stranger approaching the door. They don't like that. That makes them feel uneasy. It makes them feel anxious, right? That's the aversive side of this. And naturally, the dog is going to do something to express that anxiety, right? Let's just say the dog starts barking. So the dog's barking and the UPS man drops off the package and gets in his truck and drives off. Well, we know that's what the UPS man does, right? He drops off the package and he leaves. But from your dog's perspective, they think, hey, my barking, my freaking out is what made him leave. So the relief of that pressure was from my behavior of barking at that guy, right? And that's a very easy way to start creating a dog that barks at strangers that come to the door in an attempt to get them to go away, right? Once again, that was formed because you didn't manage the dog's day-to-day. You gave them too much freedom to figure stuff out on their own. You want to guide their behavior. You want to teach them what to do in these situations, and you want to teach them to obey these commands no matter what's going on around them. But we're not there yet. We're all starting from the very beginning. So because of that, we have to start by managing and supervising the dog every moment of their life in the beginning, so that we don't create any unwanted behaviors that we're going to have to undo later. And that's where the crate and the leash come in, and that protocol about if you can't directly supervise the dog, they go in the crate. If you can directly supervise the dog or interact with them in some way, then they can be out of the crate but on a leash, and you're able to control them physically with that leash or tag line if you need to. That's what that is all about. You essentially don't allow the dog any room to make mistakes right now, especially since they don't know any better. You're basically preventing them from doing what works for them because you're never giving them the opportunity to figure out what works for them all on their own. And in this way, you can prevent them from developing unwanted behaviors that you're going to likely want to undo later on. One more very important aspect to this new routine that we're going to add in is the dog's feeding schedule. Now, this is also something that gets overlooked quite a bit by a lot of pet dog people, and that is understanding how important food drive and food motivation is for good training. Something I want everybody to know, something I want everybody to understand, is that if you do not, at the very least, have enough food drive to teach the dog things with, if they're not motivated enough for food, then you are basically forced to use a lot of aversion and a lot of punishment to teach the dog things. And I know there's still trainers out there that do it that way. I am not one of them. I will flat out refuse to train a dog that does not have enough food motivation, because I know what is required now, what I would have to do to teach that dog. And the thing is that's not the way you want to go about it in the early stages if you can at all avoid it. Now, the good news is that all dogs will have a food drive at some point. If your dog or a dog you know doesn't seem to be very motivated for food, it's not that they're not motivated for food, it's that they are either being fed too much and or the food is available all the time. And between those two things, that will really knock down a dog's food drive. So what we're going to do is create a feeding schedule that's going to help us develop enough food drive that we can work with later on. Because the thing is, like, yes, you can use toys, you can use fetch and tug as a form of positive reinforcement, but that's very genetic. The dog is either going to enjoy that enough to learn new behaviors off of, or they're not, and you can't really manipulate that. But the thing about food drive is that all biological things have to take in energy somehow. As mammals, we eat. That's how we do that. And dogs are no different, right? They're not going to just not eat. They're not going to just refuse food until they die. No, they're going to eat at some point. The problem is that they think food is always available and it's in abundance. So there's no urgency around it. And that essentially comes from free feeding. And free feeding is very common with a lot of pet dog people. But that is something I am totally against unless you absolutely have to for some medical reason. But that absolutely, for most dogs, destroys their food drive. If you have a real chow hound, you can feed them all day, every day, and they're still going to take more food. Some dogs are like that. But for a lot of dogs, they have a limit, and they're just like, I don't want no food, right? So where I recommend you start with this is you schedule the dog's feeding. Twice a day, 3 times a day. 3 times a day is a standard puppy schedule, but for adult dogs, 2 times a day. But whatever, just schedule it. Have once in the morning, once in the evening, or once in the morning, one midday, once in the evening. And take a look at the back of the food bag that you're feeding your dog. Find their weight range, and find how much they're supposed to get in a day, their daily allowance or their ration, right? And then split that in half if you're doing twice a day, split that in thirds if you're doing it 3 times a day, right? And what you're going to do is put that portion down, offer it to them for 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever you think is appropriate to your dog. And then if they don't finish it, I'm going to pick it up, put it back in the food bag, and they don't get to finish it off. And they'll have another opportunity to eat midday or in the evening and do the same thing, right? And you're just going to repeat this over and over again until eventually the dog eats everything that you put down. And that's ultimately what you're looking for, that they eat everything you put down and they do it relatively quickly every time. That's when you know their food drive is in a pretty good spot, and they're going to be a lot more likely to take food from you when you start doing training later. Because what we're going to do is at some point we're going to stop giving them food from the bowl, at least for one of those meals, and we're going to use that food to train them with. That's going to be their reinforcement. So it's important that the dog wants food and is eager to eat, right? Otherwise, we're not going to ever get anywhere, and you're going to be forced to use a lot of pressure and punishment to get them to do what you want. And that's not good at all for the early stages, right? I'm not against punishment and aversive training methods if they're done correctly and at the right time and for the right reasons. And doing it in the beginning when you're trying to develop a relationship with the dog and teach them things is not the place to do it. The better place for that style of training is towards the end of training, where you're ironing out behaviors and you're really working them through things that they've struggled with, or just things that positive reinforcement couldn't help them through for whatever reason. So it's not that I'm against those things, it's just you got to do them at the right time for the right reasons. One little variation I wanted to talk about with this, depending on whether you have a puppy or an adult dog, is that if you have a puppy, it's totally okay once the puppy is at least a little comfortable with you to go out and about with them and allow them to experience new things around new people and healthy, safe dogs to be around, right? So if you have a new puppy, I'm assuming the puppy is probably anywhere between 6 to, 12 weeks old probably is when a lot of people acquire their young puppies. What you need to know is that a dog's true socialization phase is whenever they're right around 6-8 weeks to about 14-16 weeks. After that, the socialization game changes a little bit. But between that range of 6-8 weeks to 14-16 weeks, it's a good idea to take them out and about and get them new exposure with new dogs, new people, new sights, smells, sounds, all that sort of stuff. Get them exposed to a lot of things. Now, I do realize that a lot of vets will say, hey, your dog's not vaccinated, or your puppy's not completely vaccinated, don't take them around everywhere. And that is true. You have to use some common sense with this. But if you use some common sense, the likelihood of the puppy getting some sort of disease from something out in the world is very unlikely, compared to if you keep that puppy locked up in your house and you don't take them out and about anywhere, then the likelihood of them developing some sort of socialization or social or reactive issues is quite a bit higher. Like, that's very likely at that point. So what you want to do is take that puppy out and about. Just don't take them anywhere where a lot of dogs congregate, right? So don't take them to dog parks. I don't recommend dog parks for anything, frankly, but especially for this, right? Because you don't know how vaccinated those dogs are or aren't, how healthy those dogs are or aren't that hang out there. You don't know what their behaviors are going to be like, how they respond around puppies. So that's just a bad place to go. Do not go to a dog park with a puppy. Don't go to a dog park, period. Even if you have an adult dog, I don't really recommend that. Probably you want to avoid pet stores, right? Lots of dogs go in and out of there for the most part. I would probably avoid that. Even try to avoid going to the vet too much, right? That's where all the sick dogs go, so you don't want to take them there. It's kind of like taking your toddler to go get their checkup, and then you come home with some plague, right? That happens all the time with kids. It happens with puppies as well. So don't do that. But if you go places where they can interact with all the people you want them to, let them interact with, or just experience, just be around new sights, smells, and all that sort of stuff. Just let them take in a bunch of different environmental things. Because once they exit that true socialization period, it'll be a lot easier to manage them in those new environments, right? Because they got that exposure early on. But if you got a new dog, understand that you're well past that, right? You're well past that true socialization phase, and the socialization game is quite a bit different for you there. And it's not important. It's not a priority at all to get the dog out and about new places. In fact, I would advise against it unless you know for a fact that dog is very well behaved, very well mannered in public settings. then it's all whatever at that point. But if you notice the dog is a little reactive, a little uneasy, you can tell that they weren't taught what to do, or maybe they didn't get a lot of socialization whenever they were a young puppy, then don't continue to go out into the real world with them, because all you're going to do is develop more of that reactivity habit. And if your goal is to get rid of that reactivity one day, or at least be able to manage it in a realistic way, then you're not going to want to allow that dog to continue practicing being reactive. That's actually step one in any reactivity training, is stop allowing the dog to be reactive, right? You got to keep them from practicing that. So you can start doing that now. So I think if you have a new adult dog, or you're working with a dog that you've had for a while, if you know they're completely fine in new environments and they're not reactive, then whatever, you can do whatever you want. If you're unsure, or you know that they are reactive, don't continue going out and about in places and making that worse if your plan is to undo that at some point in time.